You are Mrs. Rita Elaine Matson of 22 Lavender Way, Scarborough.
I am.
Widow of Norman Matson.
Yes.
Mrs. Matson, you were on stage with your husband when he was shot.
Yes.
Did you load the gun that shot him?
So I believe.
Why did you do this, Mrs. Matson? It was something of a change in the routine of the act, was it not?
We usually didn't do it like that. Norman always preferred a member of the audience to participate. But I had loaded both guns on odd occasions in the past.
And why was that, Mrs. Matson?
Sometimes the audience wouldn't cooperate, or even if they did, they didn't load the gun properly.
Why did you decide to load the gun on this particular evening?
One of the volunteers looked as if he'd had a few.
You mean he was drunk?
Not exactly stoned, but pretty high. I could see him taking hours to load the thing or not doing it properly, so I did it myself.
Now, the gun used was a muzzle loader.
That's correct.
What was it loaded with?
Black powder, a round silver bullet and a wad.
A wad being a small paper or felt disc.
Yes, it's used to keep the powder and the bullet packed tightly at the bottom of the barrel.
Yes. Mrs. Matson, how many times had you assisted your husband in the performance of this particular illusion?
I can't give the exact number, but it must be well over 2,000 times.
Had anything ever gone wrong with it before?
No, never. Mind you, that was probably because Norman was absolutely meticulous about all his props and equipment. He did all his own maintenance, and he wouldn't allow anybody to touch anything.
Not even you?
Certainly not me. He wouldn't even let me in the room when he was cleaning the guns.
So it is a fact, then, that you never got to examine the guns closely?
No, I used to hand them over to be loaded during the act or load one myself, but that's as far as it went.
Did you know how all his illusions worked?
Some of them I did, but not all of them.
Did you know how his trick with the guns was done?
No.
But surely, Mrs. Matson, in order to assist in the act, you must have known what to do.
Oh, I knew what I had to do, my lord. Norman saw to that, but I never knew why.
But you mean to say that after 6 years of marriage, 8 years acting as his assistant, he never told you, never hinted in any way how the illusion was done?
No, my lord, and that's the truth.
It must have made the work of an assistant extremely difficult.
Oh, it did, because you were never sure why you were doing a certain thing, whether it was for dramatic effect or because an illusion wouldn't work if you didn't do a particular thing.
Well, didn't you ask your husband?
Yes, but Norman was unbelievably secretive. He was terrified that somebody would steal his ideas. What you don't know, you can't tell, he used to say. Mind you, it wasn't as daft as it sounds.
Well, what do you mean, Mrs. Matson?
If an assistant isn't sure what is or isn't important in an act, then you've got to go right through the whole thing, every performance exactly as laid down. You can't start cutting corners, improvising or getting careless.
So you feel that perhaps his excessive fear of plagiarism actually helped the act?
Yes, in a strange way it did.
Thank you, Lord. Mrs. Matson, you've heard Miss Nolan and Miss Greenway admit to having affairs with your husband.
Yes?
Did you know about these affairs?
Yes.
What was your reaction?
Well, I didn't like it, if that's what you mean.
Did you do anything about them?
Yes, I complained to Norman.
And what happened?
He hit me.
Did your husband often strike you?
No, not often. I mean, to hear people talk, you think that Norman beat me up all the time and laid up every woman in sight. But it's all a big exaggeration. Most of the time, Norman was generous, affectionate, an easy-going man. He was fun. He was wonderful to work with and a great artist.
Were you in love with your husband?
Well, I suppose I must have been. I stayed with him for 8 years. I'd still be with him now if he hadn't been killed.
Did you ever contemplate divorce?
No.
Did you ever think of leaving him?
Frequently.
But you didn't.
No.
Mrs. Matson, you've heard Miss Nolan's description of your first meeting and involvement with Norman Matson.
Yes.
Is that an accurate description? Is that how it all happened?
No. Well, yes, it's part of the truth.
You and Miss Nolan were dancing in the same club where Norman Matson was topping the bill.
Yes.
Did you plan to replace his assistant at the time, Stella, in the way that Miss Nolan has suggested?
By means of the vodka?
Yeah.
Yes and no.
What do you mean exactly?
I went out and bought the vodka, but it was Miss Nolan's money that paid for it. And the whole idea was dreamed up by another dancer in the show, Julie something or other. I can't remember her name. None of us liked Stella, and we all fancied Norman. But in the end, when it came down to it, Norman chose me. It was his choice.
You've heard Miss Greenway suggest that she was being groomed, I think the word is, to replace you as his assistant. Groomed by Mr. Matson.
Yes, well, Dolly Greenway has a very vivid imagination.
So you had no reason to believe that your husband was planning to replace you?
I know he wasn't.
How can you be so sure, Mrs. Matson?
Because I knew my husband.
Would you explain, please?
Look, Norman spent years polishing and perfecting the act. There wasn't an illusionist in Europe who could touch him. We played the Lido in Paris, Las Vegas, all over. He was the tops. But it was a difficult act to perform. It needed precision, split-second timing. There was so much that could go wrong. Now, do you think for 1 minute he's going to throw that all away, all those years of work, because he wanted to make some little scrubber who he'd only known for a couple of months into his assistant? Oh, no. If Norman had been planning to replace me in the act with this little Miss Greenway, he would have been rehearsing with her every morning and afternoon for months, not having it off with her in Frankie Tyler's office. Norman would have made her learn all the moves and all the patter of the act until she could do it in her sleep.
His career came before everything else.
Yes, even before sex. I was with him for 8 years and I knew him better than anybody.
Now, Mrs. Matson, various witnesses have testified that on several occasions you threatened to kill your husband.
Yes.
You admit making those threats?
Yes, I also threw things at him, but it didn't mean anything.
Would you describe your marriage as unhappy then?
No, not really. It was just that we both needed to let off steam occasionally. We shouted at each other, said things that we didn't mean. That's the way we were.
Thank you, Mrs. Matson. Would you stay there, please?
Mrs. Matson, would you describe yourself as a woman of violent temper?
No, not violent.
Yet in the course of various marital rows, you've threatened to kill your husband.
Yes, I've already explained that.
Yes, that you wanted to let off steam occasionally.
Yes.
That would suggest the existence of considerable pressure.
Well, there was bound to be some pressure.
Because of your husband's infidelities?
Not only that, we were
Well, it
two
wasn't
people...
help- I'm sorry, please go on.
We were two people who lived and worked together. Some friction's bound to be expected.
But it wasn't helped by your husband's fondness for the opposite sex, now was it?
No, I suppose it wasn't.
No. Now, throughout your evidence, Mrs. Matson, you've been at pains to impress the court that your husband was a showman first, and only incidentally a lecher.
Yes.
A perfectionist, he's been described
Yes, that's
as.
true.
He would sacrifice anything or anyone to improve the act.
Yes.
Even you, Mrs. Matson?
I don't know what you mean.
How old are you, Mrs. Matson?
31.
How old?
31.
How old was Stella, the assistant you ousted?
I don't know.
Well, Mrs. Matson, now surely you studied her very carefully in order to learn how to replace her.
Well, I
Or was she in
suppose...
her teens?
No.
Was she in her 20s?
No.
Well, let's try 30s.
Yes, I suppose so.
Thank you. Now, would you say that your physical attraction played an important part in your act?
Well, I don't know. Everything helps, of course.
You're being much too modest, Mrs. Matson. Much too modest. I have here a photograph of you taken by a club photographer. Exhibit number 1, my lord. Now, it shows a point in your act, does it not, when your husband, as Count Dracula, prepares to tear your dress off and bury his fangs in your neck.
Yes.
It would seem to necessitate a considerable exposure of your person.
Yes.
When was this photograph taken?
I don't know.
Don't you? I do, Mrs. Matson. 6 years ago at a nightclub in Brussels. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, I think so.
Yes. Now, you knew your husband was looking for a younger and more attractive assistant, didn't you?
No.
I put it to you, Mrs. Matson, that Stella was replaced for precisely that reason. And you were terrified of proving equally expendable.
I was his wife.
Miss Greenway says he wanted a divorce.
She's lying.
You wouldn't be the first wife to have eliminated her husband so as to prevent another woman from marrying him.
But that's murder.
Just what you're charged with, Mrs. Matson. You've also been at pains to impress this court with the intricacy of your husband's illusions.
That's right.
No one, you've said, could hope to learn how to become your husband's assistant without months of rehearsal.
Well, you try being shot at 6 nights a week with live bullets.
Yet you took Stella's place at very short notice, didn't you?
The act was much simpler in those days.
Yes, but the gun routine was still a part of the act, wasn't it?
I can't remember. It may have...
Mrs. Matson, was the gun routine a part of the act then, or was it not?
Yes!
Yes, thank you very much. A routine that you insist that even after 8 years you still don't understand.
I don't know how the illusion is done.
You can't have it both ways, Mrs. Matson.
I don't know what you mean.
If you don't know how the illusion was done, then it follows, does it not, that no great skill or intelligence was required of your husband's assistance. Now, if, on the other hand, months of rehearsal were required, plus skill and intelligence, then it also follows, does it not, that you must have known how the shooting illusion was performed. And when you loaded the gun that night in the 501 Club, you thereby intended to kill your husband.
case of the Queen versus Matson will be resumed tomorrow in the Crown Court.